She played the piano that night. She laughed. She sang the popular songs of the day, and she danced, and the friends around her at the bridge party said afterward how full of life she seemed, how gay, how happy, how entirely herself. 35 miles away, in a small bungalow in a quiet Ohio village, her husband lay dead on the bedroom floor. His hands were bound. A blood-stained hammer rested beside him, and before she left the house that evening, she had drawn a pillowcase over his face. Her name was Velma West. She was 21 years old. She had been married a little over a year. And on the last night of her husband's life, she settled an argument in the most terrible way a person can, cleaned herself up, took the car keys from his pocket, and drove off through the winter dark to a party, to laugh and sing and play the piano as if nothing in the world were wrong. This is the story of how an adored child, a jazz-age girl in a town that had no place for her, became one of the most talked-about killers in America, and of why the trial that was supposed to be the sensation of the decade never happened at all. Before we begin, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. And if forgotten stories like this one are the reason you're here, subscribe. This is all we do. This is the case of Velma West. Velma Van Wart was born in 1906 in Cleveland, Ohio, to Catherine and Bert Van Wart, and from her earliest years, she was a child made for attention. At the age of 3, she won a perfect baby contest at a local Cleveland theater, a small thing, but the kind of small thing that fixes an idea inside a family. Their daughter was pretty. Their daughter was special. Their daughter was made for the limelight. It was a role she would spend her whole life half living up to and half trapped by. Her childhood was not, in truth, an easy one. She was frequently ill, diphtheria, chronic trouble with her ears, and for much of her early life, she was treated as a fragile, delicate girl who had to be watched over. But by the time she reached 19, she was considered fully recovered, and she stepped out into a city that, in the 1920s, was alive with new energy, new money, and a new kind of freedom for young women. And Velma Van Wart took to it completely. Cleveland in the middle of the 1920s was a city riding a wave. The decade had brought extraordinary prosperity to the industrial cities of the American Midwest. Iron, automobiles, department stores, jazz clubs, picture houses. Young women worked in offices and shops. They smoked in public. They went to the dance halls and listened to the music pouring out of the clubs along the main boulevards. It was an age of remarkable change, and Velma embraced every part of it. She found work as a sales clerk at a variety shop on the west side of the city and kept it for about a year. She was sociable and engaging, perhaps, in her employer's opinion, a little too sociable, more often found in conversation with young men than attending to her counter. She was let go. But by then, another arrangement was already forming. On her lunch breaks, she had taken to visiting a nearby restaurant owned by a man in his 50s. He proposed marriage, she accepted, and a wedding was planned. She never went through with it, because in the spring of 1926, at a picnic near the shore of Lake Erie, she met a young man named Eddie. Thomas Edward West, known to everyone simply as Eddie, was born in 1902, 4 years older than Velma. He was tall, dark, and physically striking. He was the son of a wealthy nurseryman, a man who had emigrated from England and built a prosperous business, supplying trees and shrubs to households across the state of Ohio. Eddie worked in his father's nursery, earned a steady, modest wage, and lived in a bungalow the family provided in the small, deeply respectable village of Perry, on the shore of Lake Erie, some 35 miles from Cleveland. Velma broke off her engagement to the older man, and on the 4th of July, 1926, she and Eddie eloped, driving first into New York State, then into Pennsylvania, then taking the train to Chicago. The honeymoon was brief and short of money. Eddie left Velma with acquaintances while he found work, came back a week later with funds, and brought his new bride home. Home to Perry, and it was in Perry that everything began to go wrong. The life Eddie West lived was orderly, rural, and bound by community and family. The life Velma had come from was none of those things. She missed Cleveland. She missed the dance halls and the jazz, the noise and the movement, and the friends who understood her. In a village where a married woman was expected to be quiet and respectable, she smoked openly, publicly. Eddie's parents, prominent in the community, conservative in their outlook, made their disapproval plain. And the arguments between husband and wife grew frequent. She wanted to spend her weekends in Cleveland. He preferred to stay in Perry, and when he did go, the evenings were long and expensive, and his wages were only modest. So he went, and then he went less often, and then he stopped wanting to go at all. She would leave and return to her parents' house. They would persuade her back to Perry, and the arguments would begin again. The trouble was always there. It was always waiting. In July of 1927, a young woman from Cleveland named Mabel Young came to Perry to spend a holiday with neighbors of the West family. She and Velma met almost at once, and they became, in the eyes of everyone who saw them, remarkably close. They went swimming and fishing together nearly every day. Around this time, Velma took to wearing boys' clothing and cut her hair short. And when Mabel went back to Cleveland at the end of her holiday, the two of them wrote long letters to one another. Eddie West began intercepting those letters. Whatever he read in them, and whatever it meant, the tension in the household, already years deep, now gathered a new and heavier weight. The quarrels continued. Velma left and came back, and left and came back. The marriage was a machine that had been grinding itself down for over a year, and in December of 1927, it finally broke. On the evening of the 6th of December, 1927, Velma and Eddie argued. By her own later account, she wanted to go to a bridge party in Cleveland, Mabel Young's party. Eddie refused to go with her and told her she could not take the automobile. The argument turned physical. He struck her, hard enough to make her nose bleed. Earlier that same day, Velma had used a claw hammer to hang curtain rods in the bedroom. It was still there. She picked it up, and she struck her husband with it while he sat on the bed. He fell to the floor. He tried to rise, and she struck him again. He tried to rise again, and she struck him again, and again, and again. When it was over, she bound his wrists and his ankles with wrapping cord. She drew a pillowcase over his head. She covered the body with a blanket, and then she began, with a terrible calm, to make herself ready to leave. This is the part of the story that no one who hears it ever quite gets past. She washed herself. She changed her dress. She carried her soiled clothing down to the furnace and burned it. She took the automobile keys from her dead husband's pocket, and she got into the car and drove herself, alone, through the winter dark, the 35 miles from Perry to Cleveland, to a bridge party. And there, in a bright, warm room full of friends, she was, by every account, the life of the evening. She played the piano. She sang the popular songs. She laughed. She danced. The people around her would remember, afterward, how gay and full of life she had seemed, never once imagining that a few hours earlier, and a few dozen miles away, she had left her husband dead on a bedroom floor, with a pillowcase over his face. She had settled the argument, and then she had gone dancing. The next morning, the 7th of December, Eddie West did not turn up for work at his father's nursery. His brother James went to the bungalow to see what was wrong. He found the door unlocked. He went upstairs. The bedroom was in complete disorder. Blood on the floor, the walls, the bedding. A blood-stained claw hammer lay near the bed, and on the floor was a figure, bound at the hands and feet with twine, a blood-stained pillowcase over the head, a blanket drawn across the body. It was his brother. He was not breathing. The county sheriff, a large and capable officer the county knew as Big Ed, took charge at once. The scene told a partial story. Nothing of value had been taken. There was no sign of forced entry. And the way the body had been arranged, bound, covered, the pillowcase set in place with what looked like deliberate care, suggested that whoever did this had stayed in the room for some time after the killing. This was not a robbery. This was something personal and close. The sheriff's first task was to find Velma West. She was located at her mother's home in East Cleveland, where she and her mother had returned after a day of Christmas shopping. When the officers arrived with the news of her husband's death, Velma appeared shocked. She went with them without resistance to the county jail and was questioned. And through hour after hour of questioning, she was calm, remarkably, unnaturally calm, chain-smoking one cigarette after another. For 4 hours she gave the same account, that she and Eddie had quarreled, that he had stayed home while she drove to the party, that she knew nothing of any intruder. She did not confess. Then the prosecutor walked into the room carrying a newspaper. The headline read that T. Edward West had been found slain. Velma fainted. When she came around, and the prosecutor had briefly stepped out, she turned to the sheriff and said she would tell the truth, and she wrote out her confession in her own hand. The medical examination confirmed the horror of it. Eddie had been struck 6 to 8 times in the head with the claw hammer. He had fallen early and tried to rise 4 separate times, and each time the blows had come again, exactly as Velma herself described. He was 25, over 6 feet tall, and in excellent physical condition. Velma West was 5'5" and weighed 107 pounds. On the 12th of December, Velma West was charged with first-degree murder. When the charge was read aloud, she collapsed and then wept. Her uncle said she had mistaken the judge's words for a sentence of death, and that the shadow of the electric chair had entered her mind and would not leave. Her trial was set for March of 1928, and by then, the case had become a national sensation. A pretty 21-year-old flapper, a girl who smoked and danced and played jazz on the piano, accused of the hammer slaying of her own husband. Even the famous defense attorney Clarence Darrow, without being hired, offered his opinion to the press that Velma had simply broken under the weight of a cramped, dull, small-town life she had never been built for. On the morning the trial was to open, the courtroom filled an hour early. Almost every seat was taken by a woman. But the trial never happened. As the jury was being selected, Mabel Young sent an 8-page letter to the sheriff. Its full contents were never made public, but the nature of what it revealed about the relationship between the two women made a public trial an extremely delicate prospect for everyone involved. It also emerged that Velma had returned to the bungalow the morning after the killing to retrieve the car keys, a detail that badly complicated any claim of self-defense. And so, quietly, a deal was reached. Velma pleaded guilty to second-degree murder. She answered the judge's questions in a whisper, and she was sentenced to the women's reformatory at Marysville for the rest of her natural life. The prosecutor said plainly that the plea had been accepted to spare Eddie's parents, prominent, well-connected people, the ordeal of a public trial. Velma West arrived at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in March of 1928. She was 21 years old. She would never leave it as a free woman. By the accounts of those who watched her there, her decades inside were not without their strange distinctions. She was a model prisoner. She studied stenography. She played the piano and sang for the other inmates, the same gifts that had charmed a bridge party on the last night of her husband's life. She was trusted enough to wear the honor dresses instead of the standard uniform and to escort visitors through the institution. She learned, in 1929, that Mabel Young had died in the catastrophic fire at the Cleveland Clinic, one of 123 people killed when stored X-ray film ignited and filled the building with poison gas. Then, one night in June of 1939, Velma and 3 other inmates slipped through a door, down to the basement, and simply walked out of the reformatory, helped by a passed key. She hitchhiked as far as Texas, and for 36 days she was a fugitive with her photograph in newspapers across the country. She was found in Dallas, working as a waitress under a false name, and brought back, and in the years that followed, she stopped fighting it. When she became eligible for parole again in 1959, she told the board she preferred to stay. Her father was dead. She did not wish to be a burden to her mother and brother, and by then her heart was failing, and she spent most of her days in the prison hospital. She died at Marysville in October of 1959, 53 years old. The bungalow where Eddie West spent the last hours of his life still stood for a time in Perry, an ordinary white house among the nursery grounds. There is no marker there now. What remains is the record, a young woman who played the piano and laughed and danced on the worst night of her life, and then drove home through the winter dark, alone, to a village that had never been hers. If this story stayed with you, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe cases like this one deserve to be remembered, subscribe. The next one is already coming.